Danzig is a city in Poland next to the Baltic Sea. Now, even though this is a Polish city, doesn't necessarily mean it's not related to Germany. The history begins way back in the Middle Ages, where some Polish people decided they were going to put down a stronghold there in the year 780. This guy's name was Mieszko I of Poland. This guy, he ruled some dynasties for a while, and it went up to the year 999, 997, etc., sometime around then. Nobody really knows that much about that time period because it was so long ago. But then a little bit later, a couple hundred years later, you have a bunch of German settlers that come into there. Knights from the time colonize the area, replacing all the Kashubian, which are Polish people that were there. And around 1300, 1200, they established a town right near that old stronghold, and it was at first a Slavic fishing settlement. But then, about 150 years later, this Grand Duke of Lithuania named Casimir IV of Poland gave Danzig, at the time named Gdansk, the great privilege, which was basically granting it its independence after he had stayed in it for 5 weeks, which basically meant that the Kingdom of Poland at the time could not control it. And so that's basically how that got started, with them being a free city. Now, fast forward several hundred years, it went to be a part of Prussia in the 1700s, and then it returned to being a free city again in the 1800s. In 1814, it went back again to Prussia, until 1871, when Prussia dissolved, and then Germany decided it was going to pop up. Modern-day Germany at that point had been established in 1871, and it was a part of Imperial Germany up until the end of World War I, when Poland came back around, because there was no Poland in that time period, and the Polish wanted it, and the Germans wanted it, because it's right next to the Baltic Sea, and who doesn't want a city right next to the Baltic Sea? It was a really nice thing to have, and everybody wanted it, and that caused quite a bit of conflict.
So now that my partner has told you a little bit about the history of Danzig, or now known as Gdansk, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the points of interest that we chose for the city. The city has many buildings from the time of the Hanseatic League. Most tourist attractions are located along or near the Duliga or Long Street and Dilugi Targ, or the Long Market, a pedestrian thoroughfare surrounded by buildings reconstructed in historical 17th century style and flanked at both ends by elaborate city gates. This part of the city is sometimes referred to as the Royal Road, as the former path of processions for visiting kings. And for our first point of interest is the Golden Gate, which is one of the most notable tourist attractions of the city. It was raised in 1612 to 1614 in place of the 13th century Gothic gate. Both sides of the gate have attics with figures symbolizing citizens' qualities. They were designed in 1648 by Jeremias Falk, and reconstructed in 1878 because the originals were damaged by time and climate. From the west side, they represent peace, freedom, wealth, fame. And from the east side, they represent long-lasting agreement, justice, piety, and prudency. The Latin inscription on the gates read, "In agreement, small republics grow. Because of disagreement, great republics fall." St. Mary's Church is our second point of interest, and it is one of the largest brick churches in the world. It was begun in 1379, from 1577 until 1945, when it was named the Marienkirche. It was the biggest evangelical Lutheran church in the world. It is 105.5 meters long, and the nave is 66 meters wide. Inside the church is room for 25,000 people until the 20th century. Both the church interior and exterior were well preserved until the church was severely damaged in World War II. During World War II, the storming of Danzig City by the Red Army in 1945, The wooden roof burned completely, and most of the ceiling fell in. 14 of the large vaults collapsed, some of the windows were destroyed, and in places the heat was so intense because they tried to burn some portions down that some of the bricks melted, especially in the upper parts of the tower, which acted as a giant chimney. The floor of the church, containing priceless gravestone slabs, were torn apart by Soviet soldiers attempting to loot the corpses buried underneath.